Welcome back. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed your break. Please take your seats as soon as possible. For this third and last session, we will be discussing how we can improve subnational government access to external resources to finance infrastructure investment. The roundtable will be moderated by Serge Alou, Special Advisor at UCLG. But first, however, to set the scene, I am pleased to give the floor to Courtney Wheeler, Policy Analyst at the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities at the OECD. Courtney, the floor is yours.
Distinguished guests, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to set the scene for this third roundtable. I'll start with some important context. First, to say that significant infrastructure investment is needed globally to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, mitigate and adapt to climate change, and build resilience in regions and cities. The OECD has estimated that globally $6.3 trillion of investment is needed per year to sustain global growth and meet basic needs. But to meet the Paris Agreement, an additional $3 trillion is needed annually. This is a big challenge. Second, I want to mention that subnational governments have a key role to play, as we've heard throughout the day today. They provide the infrastructure that is essential for economic developments, well-being and climate adaptation, and are responsible for 40% of public investment on average. Thankfully, as mentioned by Lamia earlier today, their role is being increasingly recognised in international fora, including the G20 and through many of the development partners here. 2 weeks ago, the G20 finance ministers endorsed the G20 OECD policy toolkit on mobilising funding and financing for infrastructure investment in regions and cities. This document turns an important eye on subnational infrastructure investment at the G20 forum and highlighted and used World Observatory data to highlight that subnational governments are responsible for 60% of public investment in G20 countries, much higher than the 40% as a global average. Third, and finally, as a starting point, I want to note that subnational infrastructure investment requires an enabling environment and adequate funding and financing. It requires well-designed fiscal and regulatory frameworks, good institutional capacity, mechanisms for coordination and cooperation, deepened financial markets, affordable financing, access to funding, particularly to meet ongoing costs and to repay finance, and various investment approaches such as PPPs. The World Observatory is an important tool to understand and better support subnational infrastructure investment. Let me now dive into the data, starting with subnational public investment and then focusing on finance. This first chart shows that on average, subnational governments are responsible for 40% of public investment and about 1.5% of GDP. Subnational public investment varies from almost zero in some countries to almost 90% of investment and 3% of GDP in countries like Canada and Kazakhstan at the top and middle of the chart. In the 19 federal countries with data available, almost 60% of total public investment is subnational. This year we expanded the World Observatory with additional data on least developed countries. Here we see that subnational investment is below 12% of total public investment and 1% of GDP in 7 of the 10 countries with data available. Notable exceptions are Rwanda, Ethiopia and Nepal. Nepal is a particular outlier, with subnational governments responsible for over 50% of public investment, which represents 5.5% of GDP. This is shown in the top right corner of the chart. As a percentage of GDP, subnational investment varies widely across different country groups. The high-income group and the Asia-Pacific top these charts. Subnational investment as a percentage of GDP in the Asia-Pacific is 2.4% of GDP. In Africa, it is only 0.7%, which represents 24% of total public investment. There is scope for more subnational investment in many countries. Looking now at the COVID crisis, data show that subnational direct investment decreased by 0.4% in 2020 on average. Investment increased, however, in 28 countries and decreased in 28 countries. Lithuania, for example, subnational investment increased by 42% in 2020, partly through the acceleration of investment plans. This was supported by a 15% increase in fiscal transfers from the central government and loosened borrowing rules for subnational governments. While we only show 2020 data here, we know that subnational governments are a key part of subsequent fiscal packages. They often have a strong focus on green investment, as shown in the European Recovery and Resilience Facility and the Korean New Deal, which will be partly implemented by subnational governments. Now moving to financing the high upfront costs of infrastructure investment. Debt statistics provide an important indication of subnational infrastructure, as most countries have a golden rule that limits subnational borrowing to be used for investment purposes. Subnational governments have about 10% of total public debt, which is on average 7.9% of GDP. There is large variation, however, across the 95 countries with data available, with Canada a clear outlier, where subnational government debt represents almost 80% of GDP. The United States, Spain, and Japan all have levels above 30%. There is also a big difference between unitary and federal countries. In unitary countries, subnational debt is around 6% of total government debt, while it is 20% in federal countries. As outlined by Lemia earlier today, subnational debt also varies across country groups. Low and middle income countries, it only represents around 2% of GDP. In high income countries, it is around 13%. Subnational government debt is higher in Asia Pacific, Europe, and North America. There could be scope to increase the use of debt for productive and quality subnational investment, but this also needs to be accompanied by the right financial management systems, institutional capacity, and fiscal responsibility frameworks. Looking now at the different sources of debt, we can note that the use of bonds is higher in federal countries, in upper middle and high income countries, and in the Euro-Asia, Middle East, and West Asia. While larger and more creditworthy subnational governments with certain fiscal frameworks can issue bonds directly on capital markets, as shown in orange, most subnational governments rely on loans to finance debt, as shown in blue. Multilateral development banks, commercial lenders, as well as national and subnational development banks all have an important role to help finance this subnational investment. Improving subnational access to bond markets is one way to do this, and I'm sure the panel might discuss this a bit later. Finally, looking at the COVID crisis, we can see that total outstanding subnational debt increased by 7.6% on average. It increased in 37 of the 47 countries with data available. Most countries took measures to relax debt prudential rules, as in Colombia or Portugal, to reduce subnational debt burden, as in Brazil or Italy, or to establish municipal liquidity facilities, as in the United States. The country profiles in the WOFI show that changes can depend on country-specific factors, including the size of the scissor effect, levels of subnational government or central government support, changes to borrowing rules, and choices about investment timing. I'll conclude the presentation here. I hope that this provides some useful insights for the upcoming panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Courtney, for your key insights to set the scene. Now I am pleased to give the floor again to Serge Alou from UCLG for the moderation of the roundtable. Serge, the floor is yours.
Merci Michael, merci Courtney.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Courtney. This is the last panel, the last roundtable. I was not supposed to moderate that panel. Unfortunately, I had to replace my colleague who's been infected with COVID. She was in Abidjan last week, and I will wish her well.
Donc, alors, je vais faire ça aussi bien que je peux.
Well, I will do my best. And first of all,
Le plateau.
I would like to call to the podium our guests, our panelists for this last session. First, Rachana Shrestha.
Asian Development Bank. Violeta Kurudu, the mayor of Kruzesti municipality in Moldova, small European country. François Yatta, directeur des opérations et de l'assistance.
Director of Operations and Technical Assistance with UCLG Africa, regional African section, and an expert in financing and funding issues.
Klukas,
Flo Klukas,
Councillor of Cheltenham, and representative as well of the CMR, which is the European section, the Council of Europe and European Municipalities and Regions, which is the European section of UCLG. And finally, Nicolas Pinvin, voilà, donc, qui lui travaille avec une agence de notation.
He does work with a rating agency, Fitch Ratings.
D'être là. Comme on l'a fait pour les précédentes sessions, on aura 2 tours de questions. Hein. C'est comme ça qu'on s'est dit qu'on allait organiser les débats de la journée. Donc, une première série de questions sur les défis auxquels sont confrontées les collectivités territoriales de par le monde pour accéder au financement externe. Donc, première série de questions autour des défis auxquels ces collectivités sont confrontées. Et puis, une deuxième série de questions qui touchera plus aux recommandations. Qu'est-ce qu'on pourrait faire pour améliorer l'accès des collectivités territoriales à ces financements. Ces financements sont d'ordre très divers et peuvent être mobilisés à différentes échelles par différents acteurs. Il y a bien sûr tout ce qui relève de l'aide publique au développement pour les pays du Sud, globalement. Il y a un certain nombre de dispositifs qui existent dans les pays du Nord. Donc, Violetta nous parlera de l'accès au financement européen, par exemple. Il y a le rôle que peuvent jouer les banques de développement. La Banque asiatique de développement est un de ces instruments qui peuvent faciliter l'accès au financement des collectivités territoriales. Et puis, il y a les agences de notation. Alors, ça, c'est très intéressant et on a souhaité qu'une agence de notation soit présente à ces débats parce qu'on les entend assez peu, en fait, sur la façon dont elles perçoivent la possibilité pour les collectivités territoriales d'avoir accès à ces financements et quelles sont les contraintes qu'elles identifient et comment quelles recommandations elles aussi peuvent faire auprès des collectivités pour améliorer cet accès. Et puis nous aurons des expériences plus, je dirais, portées par des collectivités, des associations de collectivités avec François, qui nous parlera, je l'espère, de la vaste initiative qu'ils essaient de construire en Afrique aujourd'hui pour faciliter l'accès des collectivités au financement et Flo de la même façon en Europe. Voilà le paysage dressé. Alors je voudrais commencer à tout seigneur, tout honneur, comme on dit en français, par Violetta. Violetta, if you just want... Alors Violetta parle un peu français, parle un peu anglais, il faudrait parler roumain, mais je ne parle pas...
Violetta speaks a bit of French, a bit of English and Romanian, but and I speak Russian too. Oh, Russian. My Russian's better than my English.
So, Violetta, so what is the current situation in Moldova and in your particular city with regard to access to external financing? Focusing on the challenges, what are the problems are you facing in your city to access these external financing? Violetta.
Thank you, Serge, and thank you for the opportunity to be here with you and to tell about my country, my small country. If you know, Moldova is between Romania and Ukraine. And we have now 900 local authorities, and the population is about 3 million, but I don't think that now we have 3 million of population. It's maybe 2.5. So I will try in 5 minutes to say the situation in Moldova, and I will take a look at my notes. The main source at the moment is national funds. Till this year, we had some funds like for energy efficiency, ecology, but this year our government created a new fund. The name is Fund for Local and Regional Development, and all the local authorities applied with some projects like water supplies or sewage system or gas pipes or general urban plan like my village. We don't have international funding. No international funding except for embassy embassy projects. And I want to give you 2 examples. For example, for the USA Embassy, for example, Ambassadors Fund for Cultural Conservation, or another project from the Polish Aid, co-financing of 18 local action groups in the implementation of local micro-projects and providing technical support for adjustment of the strategic action plans. These are small projects, more related to cultural projects, not something that can truly have an impact on the infrastructure of the municipalities. All investments in Moldova came through donors, sometimes by USAID, GIZ, UNDP, UN Women. And one of the big challenges is the fact that often my municipalities, for example, cannot apply to a project on its own. We need to partner up with other municipalities in order to apply to projects. This is a challenge because donors no longer grant money to small villages, only to bigger ones. Therefore, most of the time, the same big villages win projects, while the smaller ones are ignored or rejected. Another problem is that existing projects are very small. For example, we have a project now for waste management that is financed by USAID and is about 240,000 euro, and our contribution is 40% from this sum, which is a very, very big sum for us, is a huge sum, and the problem is that we don't have the budget for it. We get no budget allocated for contributions, and as we don't have this money, we cannot apply, as all projects need a contribution. We would like the government to support us with the contribution. Donors currently provide funds for important projects in general, but not part of the top priorities of local governments. We would love to work on green economy or climate change and so on, but our villages still miss basic necessities such as no proper water supply, sewage system, gas pipes, proper roads, and that's why it's a difficult, and this is the situation in Moldova in general.
Merci beaucoup, Violeta.
Thank you very much, Violeta. Now I've noted some key points there. Now the first thing is the question of the thresholds. We see that there are many municipalities need to have funding, and the ticket size of the project is too low for them to interest donors, and so this is a real problem. So how can we solve that problem? This is a real question that has to be addressed. There's a cut-off point or a threshold that you have to reach. You need to have a certain amount involved before anyone's interested in funding it. And then, of course, there's the question, well, I understood that there are subsidies. You don't really have access to the financial market, if I've understood correctly the situation in Moldova. So you have to have your own resources to jointly fund a project so that you can get funding from an outside funder. Of course, they all want to have a co-funding arrangement, and it's difficult to get this joint financing for a small municipality. So we can see there's the role of national authorities or the role of associations of municipalities. As you said, they have to come together and work together so that they can get this seed funding which they need. Not flow.
View in Europe. What do you think are the main challenges for cities to access external financing?
Thank you, Serge. Would you mind if I ask a question first?
For sure, please.
Can I ask, would politicians, that is, elected politicians in this room, please raise your hand?
Mayors or elected politicians?
Any mayors or elected politicians? That was what I thought. Okay. The second question I want to ask, and I know this is a little bit off the cuff. The second question I'd like to ask is, have any of you read this wall? No? Because there is something here that says, des politiques meilleures pour une vie meilleure. And to me, that is the essence of what we are about. Because by teaching politicians, we teach ourselves, we teach governments. And you asked me to concentrate on Europe, so I'm going to say something here, which I will speak as the CEMR representative and a former European representative for the Committee of the Regions. And what I would say is, the Committee of the Regions, the European Commission, the European Union, developing specific financial programs that last not for a year, not for 2 years, not for 3 years, not for 5 years, but for 10, and then potentially 20, or as in the case of the city I used to represent, 30, makes a huge difference, because you can begin this process of creating better lives with better political knowledge and with a better way of doing things. And I'd like to place on record, if I may, Serge, for any of our European colleagues who are here, my thanks to you for all that you did to help us learn, develop, and act, because it makes a difference. And I wish you in Moldova the same joy when your turn comes. I've just dropped all my notes, as one does when one gets off as a politician. The Council of European Municipalities and Regions is the body I'm here representing today, and it is the oldest inclusive European association in Europe. It began just after the Second World War, 1951, if memory serves me right. And local and regional government from all of the countries who are involved, some 40, can have an active role in it. And it is somewhere where we exchange ideas, where we do things, and where we want to learn. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I would be delighted if you would join us. And I'm doing this on behalf of CEMR. If you would join us in November at an event on the 10th of November in Brussels, where we're going to look at local finances in Europe, unlocking investment for sustainable and resilient societies. You would be most welcome to join us. We're asked, what is there in the world at the moment, in Europe at the moment, that is actually a challenge? Well, I'm going to look at 3 matters. The first is COVID-19, which is still with us. The second is climate change, which isn't going away. And the third is the war in Ukraine and its wider impact. And I'm going to be very cheeky, and I'm going to add a fourth. And the fourth is this: people. the effect of all of those on people, how it makes people feel, think, how desperate they can be when they no longer can feed their children, heat their homes, go to work because petrol's too expensive for the car and buses might not be running, and how worried they will be for their future. All of those things affect us right now here in Europe and will continue so to do. Together, they actually present a significant existential threat to our communities, to our countries, and indeed to our planet. There is no way that we can get out of that. These difficult situations have resulted in a dramatic drop in investment opportunities and indeed a dramatic drop in people available for work. In the UK, for example, we are now short of 750,000 workers because of the impact of COVID-19. Simple as that, they can no longer work. And so that is having a huge effect. My belief is that that will be repeated across the whole of Europe, that kind of gap is what we are now facing. In November, the CEMR will release a study, and this shows that in CEMR member countries, local government debt overall was limited to 4% of GDP. That's 4%. That's 4 centimes in the euro. That's what it was limited to. And yet think what we are being asked to do as local and regional authorities. Investment that has already been made will mean that those facilities that have been built will no longer be able to be properly maintained because the money just isn't there. And these are things that we really need to take account of as we move through the next year. The need for investment is now being recognized by the European Union and national governments. And this should make a difference. But the big problem is that in creating these fantastic programs, local and regional governments weren't involved. Subnational government wasn't asked, what do you think of this? Would you like something different? How will this work? Can you do this? Do you have the ability to do this, to get all of this information that we require? And that makes a huge difference to what is actually able to be done and able not to be done. And it's something that the European Union really does need to look at, and it's something that national government needs to look at. Our economies, our countries, our communities are interdependent. Think about that for a moment, interdependent. And nothing could actually illustrate that better than climate change. And the need for the investment in green infrastructure, in digital and health infrastructure at local and regional level has, fortunately, been recognized. But action has to be swift. We can't sit in a room and talk about it forever. We need to be doing things and doing them now. And the reason is simple. It's because a flood doesn't stop at a border. COVID-19 doesn't stop at a border. These things that affect us now, as indeed in the war in Ukraine, hasn't stopped at a border, as you in Moldova are finding out. So all of these things that actually have that level of presence have to be tackled, have to be attacked, have to be sorted out. And that means action at senior level, but it means talking to us at local level to make sure that we can make things happen, and make things happen better, make things happen that are more effective in what we wish to do. I mentioned the war in Ukraine, and that has been devastating for Ukrainians because the country, their home, is no longer a safe place. Families are split asunder, and they have become the victims, the guinea pigs of a new wave of war, a different way of doing things, of using people as a weapon. That is not right and should not be allowed to happen. But those effects are actually far-reaching. For Ukrainians, yes, But for countries that border Ukraine and Europe too, local and regional authorities have been on the front line, as you have in Moldova. You have been on the front line in that war with the work that you have done looking after refugees and seeking to make sure that no further harm comes to them. Now, food and energy security are at risk. The result in the cost of living for millions of people is devastating, and we will know that from our own home villages, towns, cities, and regions. Those of us at the subnational level know the pressure this has brought, how difficult it is to get the money together to make sure people can be fed, can be helped. It is really a difficult situation. And what I would like to say, Serge, is that if we look at local, I mean, the people have actually talked about the figures before, so I'm not going to go through those again. But subnational governments are major investors in local infrastructure. And here is a real opportunity to make changes that will influence the lives of ordinary people, of ordinary communities, for the better. But we have to have that level of interaction with national and European government to make that happen. Long-term investments build communities. They actually build businesses. They build economies and they build growth. And we need socially inclusive services and facilities to be built too. We all know the problem. We've been talking about it all day. We need more investment. So, let's look at this, let's learn from one another, and let's find the solution.
Thank you. What we're trying to do here. Thank you, Flo. Thank you for this remarks, I would say. I will move to François. François, in Africa?
No, François. Africa's going to see extreme urban growth over years to come, and there's a real need for investment. So what are the problems that you're up against, or what are the problems that the people of Africa are confronted with? No, thank you, Serge, and thank you for inviting us to this important event. Now, if we want to have access to external resources, you have to have a good financial basis to start with. And in Africa, we have two financial bases. The first is state transfers to the local authorities. But there's not enough because in Africa, we don't really have the principle of subsidiarity. I'll explain what I mean. Now, you can look at any country. You've got local authorities, they build schools, or you've got ministries that build schools, or other bodies that build schools. Now, we've done assessments in some countries. Look at Côte d'Ivoire, which is next door, and we can see that all the financial transfers to the local authorities, when you look at them in relation to legislation on decentralization, it's only 20% of what it should be. So they get 1/5 of the resources which they should be given to implement the delegations they've been given. Then the second problem is the taxation. The paradoxical situation in Africa is that local taxation is based on direct taxation. It has to be connected, whereas most of national taxation is indirect taxation. So that means that the lowest institutional level gets the most difficult taxes to collect. So this makes it very difficult, and you can see that public taxation then becomes instrumentalized. And we had some examples earlier with property taxation and problems with cadastral records and with evaluations. And so here we can see that there's a very low level of revenue from taxation. And then you have to see all that in the context of Africa. We really need to see what the situation is and compare the situation. When you look at all the forecasts for Africa for 2100, it's going to have half the population of the world by 2100. You've got a birth rate of 35 for 1,000, and you could say the highest fertility in Europe is in France, and it's 13 per 1,000, whereas we have 35 per 1,000. So you can see that the level of population is going to be the fuel for urbanization. You've got urbanization, which is going to become greater and greater. And when you look at the scope, it's considered that by 2050, we're going to have the equivalent of the 25-member EU, which will be in Africa. So it's huge. And when you look at the speed, now Paris went from 500,000 to 1 million within 1 century. And there are some cities in Africa which do it in just 20 years. So this data shows you that the investment of local authorities is really of critical importance, and the access to external resources is of vital importance. Now, just briefly, something about COVID. Well, we saw a drop in resources during the pandemic in Africa. That was a drop in transfers from national authorities, and there were other resources that went down. We did a publication recently. We looked at a model, and we saw that the scale of levels was done per region of Africa and per size of the local authorities. But what we really learned from COVID was basically 2 lessons. The first is you need to be careful that COVID doesn't end up with centralized policies, because you saw that all the initiatives for COVID in Africa were done through funding for national authorities, but then they were for authorities which had been delegated to the local and regional authorities for decades. So that was a real problem. And then there's the question of the role of financial transfers. And we saw this earlier with examples that there are some countries where, with COVID, well, the total amount of national transfers increased. But what we need in Africa is to have a counter-cyclical system. So when there's an economic crisis, you need to have more transfers to local authorities so that they can cope with the economic crisis. And when the economy is in a better situation, then you should have just normal level transfers, because we realized that a lot of the local and regional authorities had a drop of 50 to 60% in their budgets. And that's a serious threat to any principle of equality of citizens in a national context for access to public services. Well, thank you. Well, that's a very interesting view of the plight of local authorities in Africa.
The Asian Development Bank. So you're supporting subnational governments to access external funding. What is the role and what is the main challenges you see from your point of view for a greater access of local governments to external financing?
Thank you so much for the questions, and very happy to be here. Yes, Asian Development Bank has been providing support to developing member countries at the national and subnational level, but most of the support is, of course, at the national level, but we have been also supporting at the subnational government level. And what we have seen is actually, in terms of the subnational government accessing finance, we see that there is a it's like multifaceted issues, and a lot of these issues are also interrelated. It's not like, okay, this country has one issue, this country has, or this subnational governments have this issue. It's not like that. They have, and most of these subnational governments, these issues are so interrelated that it's very important that you address these in a more integrated and holistic manner rather than in a piecemeal basis. And as already highlighted also by Courtney when he was presenting this context, is it's very it's interesting that these issues are so similar. I mean, maybe in the European subnational governments as well, but in Asia Pacific, most of these subnational or local governments have these issues of the institutional capacity comes at the forefront because most of these subnational governments have very poor institutional capacity, and when I say institutional capacity, it ranges from the human resources to the systems and processes. Their operational efficiencies is very low, and because of this also their own source revenue is affected. So own source revenue is important for financing, because for them to refinance or for them to repay the loan, they need to have a strong funding. They need to have this strong revenue base, and often these subnational governments, local governments have a very poor revenue base. So that also affects their access to finance. The other issue is, that they are also very, because of the low own source revenue, they are very dependent on the central transfers. So that dependency also doesn't help. And somehow, there has been this perverse incentive, I would say, that they are not so motivated, and also political reasons also that the own source revenue mobilization is not taken very seriously by, that's what I feel, many subnational local governments, that they are still not exploiting the potentials that are there because, that dependency syndrome, that dependency is not also creating that incentive. In some governments, they have established this performance grant system where they actually add this own source revenue also as a criteria, and those who can mobilize more resources are given a higher weightage. So that's one issue. The other is also, the fiscal and regulatory frameworks. Again, we also heard from Courtney as, there are not adequate or appropriate fiscal and regulatory frameworks at the subnational governments, for the subnational governments, and this is important again, to make them credit worthy. But then talking about credit worthiness, there are a lot of factors. Again, that's why I said it's so multifaceted and it's also integrated with each other. Again, own source revenue or the revenue base also provides that the credit worthiness. And also talking about, the institutional, I'm going back to the institutional capacity because the other reason is also, I think this was covered in the earlier roundtable as well, the planning, the budgeting, and the resource management are found to be quite weak, and so it's quite a kind of, we find that this planning is done quite haphazardly and not in a systematic manner. And as earlier Dr. Banadia was saying that, the planning is not connected to the budget, the financing. So these kind of disconnects are not helping the subnational local governments in, making them. So that's why the private investors would be very cautious to be providing any kind of, funds or financing to this kind of subnational governments, and also that that brings to the borrowing. Like many subnational local governments are constrained, or they have limited borrowing authority, and in Asia Pacific we find that is actually very very low. I mean, the data, I don't have the data right now with me, but if you look at the data, it's some local governments, this is negligible borrowing actually. It's also partly also because of not having the right, the fiscal framework, but also not having the institutional capacity and not having the strong revenue base. So everything is affected, and also the financial markets. They do not have the access to financial markets. Where while the big metropolitan cities might have the access, the smaller ones do not have that access. So yes, there are a lot of issues, but not new ones, very, very similar, I think. But then I think we really need to look at it from the as integrated issues, and not as, okay, this is an issue of credit worthiness, this is the issue of institutional. It's not like that. I think it is also connected with each other. So thanks so much.
Thank you very much for this. I mean, you covered everything, no? I mean, saying that it's interrelated. Nicolas Pinvin, not sure if in English or in French. Bon, donc du point de vue d'une agence de notation, vous observez aussi les...
So from the point of view of your organisation, what do you consider to be the constraints here for local government? How can they have better access to financial markets?
If you don't mind, sir, the first question in English and the second in French, because I noticed that half of the audience is more or less English speaking, the other half is French speaking, and you know French like equality. So to your question, Serge, I would say, you know, the first constraint is to access external financing is repayment. So it's not, the access is very much conditioned by exit. It's stating the obvious, but coming the last of the row, it's easier for me to bring a synthesis than to bring new arguments. So I think we can put those constraints into 4 categories. The first is the central government's restriction to access. Arguably, most of the governments in developed countries can access external finance, but even among developed countries, you see quite a lot of cases where access is restricted, more or less. And you can mention, for example, Chile. It was mentioned this morning. No access at all for subnationals. China has some access for provinces, nothing below provinces. And then you have even Spain or Italy, which after the Eurozone crisis got quite a lot of restrictions imposed by central government and so on. So the first constraint is central government restriction. And I would say it means central government doesn't trust subnationals, to put it bluntly. Second constraint or category is when the markets or the lenders do not trust subnationals. So that there is not necessarily restriction put by government, but in practice, nothing happens. And in that case, lenders would require something, either central government guarantee or multilateral development banks, for example, stepping in, or pledges of any kind, or collaterals, etc. We'll come back to that when it comes to the solutions. The third category is when financing is accessible but is not economic. And as a result, no local government really gets to any financing. And you can, in that category, see the Turkish smaller municipalities, for example. They use a government-related bank, ILA Bank, to get the financing instead. The fourth category I would see is when financing seems to be accessible and economic, but it seems only. In fact, it goes with a number of hidden risks. And I would put in that category quite a long list. Chinese LGFVs, for example, were created by local governments to circumvent the ban I mentioned before. So in reality, I think they are more or less debt from local governments, but with less transparency, less control, etc. So they are, in fact, hidden risk for, and even now, the government accepts to recognize that and calls that hidden debt. Again, Turkey, notably for the larger municipalities, does, which access markets, tend to borrow in dollar or euro, but not hedging either the currency or the rate risk, which I think is some kind of problem from our point of view. Although they do obviously monitor and manage to some extent, but it's a problem. And you can even mention Poland with a quite massive use of floating rates, which was not a big deal until recently, but may become a problem in the future. And the French people here will remember that 10 years ago, many subnationals in France got caught by surprise with their so-called toxic loans. They had accepted to go into agreements which in fact proved quite uneconomic. So I would say 4 categories of risk, at least. The first 2, to summarize, are clearly a problem of trust, which is no wonder. Debt is about, or credit is about confidence and trust. And they are clearly related, and that was very well said before, to the robustness of the fiscal federalism and the quality of the resources, of the controls, of the responsibilities, and all the consistency between all of that. So I would say it's all about the robustness on the one hand and the flexibility on the other hand of the revenues, the expenditure, and the debt mechanisms. But that has been abundantly commented. The categories number 3 and 4, I would say, are a problem or a lack of deep and sophisticated capital markets or banking sector, or both of them. And clearly that's a wider challenge than just the subnationals. Usually, what I mentioned for those categories 3 and 4 apply also to corporations, not only to subnationals. And clearly that is probably beyond our conversation today. But at least I think local governments, notably officials, elected officials, and technicians can be trained and educated to understand what they can do within those small margins for maneuver. So that was my attempt.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up question. What do you mean by economic? It's not economic for whom?
Yes, good question. I mean affordable for local government, for the borrower.
Affordable for?
Notably as opposed to what other forms of financing could offer, that is to say, central government or donors or multilateral banks, etc., as an alternative. And as a matter of fact, in most cases of those category 3 and 4, you cannot compete with those other sources of finance without any protection, etc.
Good, thank you. Thank you very much. So, second round of questions, because I mean we are also running out of time. I would start by François, if you don't mind. Donc, on a eu un exposé, je crois, assez...
So we've had quite a thorough presentation of the various constraints faced by sub-national governments. Now, what would the solutions be? What can we do in order to improve the situation?
Une association de collectivités.
What would a group of sub-national governments do in improving access to funding? What could such a federation do to improve this situation? Thank you very much, Serge. Well, the first thing we can do is to work on the institutional environment at the national level.
Peut-être que ne connaissent pas l'institution. L'Organisation panafricaine des collectivités.
Now, there's a Pan-African Association of Sub-Regional Governments that has 2 goals. The first goal is to improve decentralization in Africa, and second, to support local governments. Now, with respect to the institutional environment, well, we have a triannual publication. We have a summit every 3 years focusing on these issues, decentralization, the role of local government. And following this summit, we publish a document on a city enabling environment rating. That is, we give countries a rating for the margin for maneuver, the freedom given to local governments to act within each country. We have 12 criteria, and we give a rating for each of these criteria. Now, of course, that's difficult. It's difficult to rate countries. You can imagine that we have ministers who get quite cross about this. They say, how do you dare give us ratings, give us marks for our work? But simply, some others have a different approach, and they ask us how they can improve. And that's very positive, because then we give them some recommendations. We tell them how they can improve the role of local government. And we say, look, if you reform in this way, your mark is going to get better. So that's the first thing to do, I consider, Serge. The second thing we are doing is an area that we're working on quite concretely. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, basically, we're trying to put in place some financing vehicles that will link up local governments and financial markets. And the reason we're doing this is, first of all, because, as you've perhaps noticed from what I said before, in Africa, urbanization is going to be particularly visible in medium-sized countries. That is, in predictions for the next 5 to 10 years, we see that these medium-sized intermediary towns are going to grow very quickly. But they're not as rich as big cities currently. They do, however, need access to financial markets, and they have two issues. The first is that they need sufficient funds. They need enough money to get involved in financial markets. There are lots of intermediary towns who don't have a sufficient debt capacity. So it's difficult for them to have access to financial markets. And the second issue they face is the pooling of costs. It's very expensive to enter a financial market. But when actors group together, they can reduce the costs of doing so. Now, another advantage of this pooling system is that large cities that are used to working on the financial market can get involved, and that means that the financial vehicle is more credible. It's more likely to succeed. And finally, another advantage of this system is that we can work with sub-regional institutions, such as one of the African Development Bank, for example, which can then help a number of sub-regional governments that are able to borrow and to reimburse their loans to work together and get involved. Now, I've often been told that these federations are clubs of rich local governments, but that's not the case. These are simply governments that are able to borrow and reimburse what they've borrowed. That's different from being rich. All local governments need to be able to learn to use these tools on the financial markets so as to invest and succeed. Now, we often have a lack of information concerning the finances of cities in Africa or towns in Africa. And without this information, it can be quite difficult to access a financial market. If one has clear information on one's debt status and so on, then one is more likely to be accepted and given access. If you don't have any information at all, then people tend to fear the worst, and they tend to give you a worse rating than the rating you'd actually have if you had the information to provide. So I think we need to raise the awareness of our members as to the importance not only of mobilizing funds and streamlining expenses, but also we need to ensure that they are aware of the need for information and good management. Let me give you an example. If you can wrap up after that, François, certainly. So, for example, we looked at a number of regional governments and we looked at their figures and we saw the figure of 1 billion euros. This was in Western Africa. And yet, sub-regional governments did have a capacity to access financial markets and borrow money. So we're really trying to improve information and hopefully in 2024, begin our first fundraising campaign. Thank you very much.
In the context of these crises that you mentioned, any opportunities, any initiatives that you see in Europe that could help foster access of local governments to external finance?
Yes, is the answer to that. The first is the CEMR would like to see the European Investment Bank act as a bank where local and regional authorities could actually go and say, we have this that we'd like to do. Can we do some work with you in order to secure some finance to make this happen? You were speaking about different sizes of towns and villages and the difficulties smaller ones have in accessing finance. I think that is true across the whole of Europe, not just in Africa, and true in Asia also. And perhaps this is one mechanism that could be used that would help. A second one that we have put forward as CEMR is actually to use the development of local and regional banks that could issue bonds. So, for example, if you had a project that you wished to do, but you were not able, because of the instances you have quoted, to access private finance, banking finance in the normal way, what you might do is use the asset to gain the opportunity to borrow using bonds. So people, in effect, would buy into your local opportunity, your local investment opportunity, by purchasing bonds. And they might be repaid over a 2, 5, 10, 15, 20-year period. But those bonds would actually secure finance, which would enable you to carry on and do the work that you wish to do. Some of this is already happening in the UK, I have to say, and my own town, Cheltenham, has actually invested in some work that was being done in other municipalities, and we will have that bond repaid in some cases within 6 months, in some cases within 2 years or 5 years. But that is already being done on a much smaller scale than I would like, but nevertheless it is being done. And the other areas where I think there is opportunity to begin to change the way we view investment is actually to say to governments and to say to the European Commission, if you invest, you're doing a huge amount to build this economy. And if you're, for example, let me take my own town. My own town is a town of 115,000 people. And we'd have a fair proportion of that town who are disadvantaged economically and where children have problems. Because we are a town of festivals and a racecourse where we have a major international tournament, we actually also have the middle classes, I'm not looking at you, but the middle classes who like to have their drugs when they come to the races. And so we have a significant impact by criminal gangs, what are known in the UK as county line gangs. They come from Birmingham to Cheltenham, and they encourage children to act as drugs mules, taking drugs around the place. And obviously that's not something that we want as a town. And so we took the decision that we were going to do things. And 5 years ago, 6 years ago, we decided that we weren't going to be able to get the sort of money we wanted. And so we decided we would become a commercial council. And what that means is we buy, we sell property, we buy, we rent property. That property brings in taxation. And interestingly, 98% of all taxation in Cheltenham is paid on time. How about that? And we discuss this with all our residents, and they have the opportunity to say they don't like it or they like it, or why don't you do this? Okay? And one of the things that that has produced is Cheltenham, which is going to develop the National Cyber Centre in one of our poorest areas. That will give us thousands of new homes, 40% of which will be affordable. In other words, those people who don't earn a high salary will be able to rent or share the ownership of one of those homes, flats or houses. It will give us new jobs, opportunities for entrepreneurs. It will give us new facilities, new leisure facilities, new health facilities, new hospitality facilities, a whole range of things in that particular area, which will build the economy of that area and indeed boost the economy of the town. And we're talking probably in the region of 10,000 homes. Okay. And over the last 5 years, 6 years, we have been acknowledged as the best commercial council in the country. And over the last, 3 years, 4 years, our asset portfolio has increased by 200 million. So we actually have 200 million pounds worth of assets more now than we had 3 years ago. And that's because we have been a council that has invested in our people. And I say that because this is what happens. And the reason I asked about politicians earlier is because in our town, I'm an elected politician. I am what might be described in Europe as a deputy mayor. I'm one of them. And in our town, we have an agreement across all parties, not just my party. They will see what is being proposed. They will have an opportunity to say whether they like it or not. Our officials, our administrators, have the same opportunity. And we then come together with the sort of investment advice that we require by a professional company to tell us whether that is something we should do. And then a report goes to the council and it is voted on by the council. And what that has done is enabled us to invest in a way that we would never have done before, in a way that I think most towns in England don't do. So it is helpful because it also builds resilience, it builds opportunity, and the profits that are made go to help those people who are in social need. So we use that to give our kids, our young people, to give our mums, to give our poorer communities better lives than they would otherwise have had. And it's one of those things that it's not easy to do, but it can be done. And I had to say, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to see any of our documents, strategies, paperwork, talk to our officials, talk to our councillors, come to Cheltenham and see what we've done. We'd be very happy to see you. And that's an offer that goes to everybody, okay? And I think that is something that we can learn from as Europeans and indeed wider afield.
And it also builds fiscal capacity at the local level, no?
It does more than that, yes, because we have now, as I say, 98% of all our council taxes are paid on time. And if people don't like what we're doing, they have the opportunity to come and speak to me, speak to my colleagues. They can put it online. They can say what they think. And then we will talk to them about it. So it has a big effect.
Thank you. Thank you. Rashana, so you've been supporting subnational governments. Just what kind of support do you provide? And what kind of support do you think that development banks, not only your bank, but in general development banks should provide to facilitate this kind of access of local government to external finance?
Right. Actually, ADB has been providing a mix of support in the form of like loans. We have also provided loans and grants to subnational governments. Like there is an example, a very recent example, where we provided loan to this Shandong province of China to establish this Green Development Fund. I mean, I will not go into details, but actually this is a very interesting project which we are piloting an innovative leveraging mechanisms to bring the private sector also into this fund to finance climate resilient infrastructures. And also we are providing technical assistance, for example, to build financial intermediary organizations, and also capacity development support, institutional capacity development. And ADB has established this Asia Tax Hub, which actually very precisely support the developing member countries, including subnational governments, in strengthening their tax administration and enhancing their revenue base. We are also providing other support like Cities Development Initiative for Asia, which is actually a joint initiative initiative, and which will help locate potential sources of financing. So we are actually doing a variety of things in the form of, grants, loans, technical assistance, trust funds, and specialized window, as I mentioned, as the Asia Tax Hub, which is actually, I would say, is a new initiative, but it has quite a bigger impact in terms of strengthening the revenue tax administration of the country. Thanks.
And just a follow-up question. Do you act as an intermediary for them to have access to other type of financing?
Yeah, well, actually, that guarantee and all is, we are doing that as well, but very, very, very few, very little. But then, it's more not, I would say it's not direct, but it's rather indirect. But we are there to facilitate, in a way, establishing, as I mentioned, the intermediary fund. Like in Nepal, we helped establish this Town Development Fund, which is an intermediary organization to support the subnational governments. So those are the things we do. It's still, providing guarantee and all is not an easy thing, and I think ADB would not be well placed to do that kind of, but we kind of somehow facilitate and support indirectly. Thanks.
Merci. Nicolas? Sur les solutions,
Thank you very much. Nicolas, with regard to solutions, what can we do to help local governments have better access to financing? Well, I would avoid giving advice directly. We don't give advice directly for regulatory reasons, but I can share a few ideas, seeing as I've worked for 25 years in this sector. Well, I'd say there's one key word here.
Solidité.
A word that ensures that borrowing is safe and reliable for local governments, and it would be subsidiarity. Now, what do I mean by subsidiarity? Well, I'm talking about a matchup between borrowing and the source of the funds. What I mean is whether there's a bank loan or a bond involved or any other source of financing, what really matters is that there be a good matchup and also that the funds are borrowed on the right scale. If a government tries to attract money from the other end of the world, there can be problems. There are various reasons for that are somewhat debatable. On the other hand, attracting local funds can be far more positive. I'm thinking about the system in Germany, where there are various systems in place for local funding. Also, there are some intermediary funding systems, for example, in Canada and in the United States, and that changes how money is borrowed. There are various systems in place, and I don't want to get into too much detail because I think we go beyond the scope of today's discussion.
Caractéristiques purement de gouvernements locaux. Sur ce point-là,
but
on arrive à la deuxième condition.
There's another aspect that needs to be taken into account, and that's the ability to reimburse funds. So not only do governments need to attract funds, but they also need to ensure that they can reimburse what they borrow. Now, much has been said on this subject.
Cadre juridique.
So I'm not going to get into legal and institutional issues or specificities perhaps here.
Je reviendrai sur le fait que
But I would say that a great deal of effort needs to be made with respect to governance and education. I mean, education of the actors involved. Let's take a practical approach. I can give you a few examples of initiatives that have been introduced to help to facilitate this process.
L'État et les collectivités.
National and local governments need to ensure that borrowers are creditworthy.
On a un certain nombre presque d'astuces qui peuvent.
And there are perhaps a few tips that can be helpful here. In Mexico, local governments
l'impossibilité d'emprunter.
Have found it impossible to borrow on financial markets. Now, it's not the national government that was preventing them from doing so. It was those who were lending the money who didn't want to lend it to local governments. So a number of trusts were set up which guaranteed those lending the money that they would be reimbursed. So this was a way of protecting the funds that improved access. We've also seen some initiatives, such as those mentioned by François, where we've had some debt agencies with or without a solidarity system between borrowers. We've seen this in Switzerland, France, and so on, so it's quite widespread in Europe. Now, these funds are more or less successful, but they do exist.
Beyond development banks, which have a crucial role to play, although they cannot generate in special circumstances in different countries, but we can also see situations where central banks will provide some additional security to the system. And I'm referring to Canada during the COVID pandemic, but also before the crisis. The government could guarantee the liquidity of the bond market so that the provincial authorities could repay their debt. And that has been true also in Australia. And in the US, there are very few support mechanisms. There are some. The states may provide support to municipalities. There are federal mechanisms as well. So there is a wide variety of mechanisms that can provide support. And of course, we have the example of Germany with maximum security, with technical arrangements between the different lenders which manage the liquidity. And each lender, of course, will demonstrate some form of solidarity also within its limits. So there is a whole variety of tools, of course, and I'm simply describing them very quickly. Coming back on the first point I made during my first statement, this is only possible when there is adequacy between the resource and the borrower.
Yes, of course. What do you need? What should be done at your level? I mean, from...
I want to say that in Moldova, our local authorities, for us, it's impossible to access bank loans. Maybe City Hall of Chisinau can take bank loans. So, what we need? We need the real reforms, administrative, financial. The local government should be consulted before these reforms are implemented, because no organizational body in Moldova knows the situation and our needs as well as we do. We need trainings for employees on how to apply to European projects, especially so now that Moldova is a candidate in the EU, and we will be getting even more opportunities to apply to European projects. And you know, for the projects for embassy, we have very complicated applications forms required in English, and sometimes I ask myself, I don't know if it's a good question for me, but why in Moldova I have to apply in English? Because I am the person in my city hall that apply, because I don't have another one who know about projects or who know how to apply to a project. When our embassy have employees from Moldova and they know very good Romanian, and I think maybe they can translate from Romanian into English. So it's a problem for us. We need also real institutional dialogue between local authorities and central authorities. The central authorities does not take us into account, although we know best what we want. And sometimes employees in central authorities say that mayors can always call them if they need something. But is unfair and not the best way to approach things. They should invite the entire CALM. Maybe you know about CALM. CALM it's a it's a Congress for local and local authorities in Moldova. It's an organization, and not the mayors separately. And we had a meeting some years ago, and one of ministry said us, "Oh, I have 100 of telephone numbers in my phone." Yes, but we are 900. And, so you understand. So another one is salary policy must be modified. Raise salaries to attract new talent, such as young employees, or retain good employees. The private sphere is much more attractive for talents in Moldova. You know that in Moldova we have very, very low salary, and it's very hard to take young people for working in our local authorities. While Moldova is an EU candidate country, the national legislation must be adapted to the European one. And the government must control, I think, the completion of projects. We have many water and sewage projects that are not yet completed. All these projects were financed by the government. And the challenge is that the government allocated a small amount, roughly 1 million lei, to many, many local governments. Was a political decision, of course, which initiated this sewage or water projects, but they were never finalized because 1 million it's not enough when a project it's about 20 million lei or 15 million lei. So all of these projects are still pending at the moment. And in the end, I want to say the only learning effect which is sustainable is learning by doing investment projects. Otherwise, huge fatigue with soft interventions and trainings that you said before. And of course, all of this had to be done in a transparent way with full commitment of the government. Government should invite us to dialogue and follow up on clearly defined actions. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à tous. On arrête là.
Well,